Two book hunters from opposite corners of the world. Book hunters collect books with a passion and ensure their safety. In times of chaos, war and other calamities, book hunters are guardians of the world's cultural heritage. This tree of knowledge lay in the street in Iraq. Written in the Middle Ages, the book had fallen into the hands of barbarians.
Sadly, the head of Jesus has disappeared. We have no idea whether or not it was cut off by Islamic State. All we do know is that here Jesus no longer has a head. But it's a beautiful restored image. On no account must it be touched, because that would ruin it completely.
In northern Iraq, Father Najib runs what could be described as an ark for persecuted books. He and his voluntary assistants want to digitize as many historical manuscripts as possible. Today, manuscripts from all over the country are brought to him, maltreated by war, just like the people who have to endure conflict. State-of-the-art technology makes an exact copy. Every ink stain finds its way into the digital world. Books and people have found refuge in Erbil, a city in the heart of Kurdish Iraq with well over 1 million inhabitants. Mosul is less than 90 kilometers away. Refugees from all over Iraq and Syria have become stranded here. Along with Father Najib, the historical library of the Dominican monks of Mosul has already fled twice from Islamic State, as it is known.
Just like us, this collection has become nomadic, because we are nomads. We are refugees, so these books are refugees too. We carried them from Mosul to Karakos, and from Karakos here to Erbil. But I hope we will be able to live in peace here. Wherever we go, we will take our books with us, because these are our roots. No mother or father would ever abandon their children. They would save them, so we are saving ourselves together.
Since 2009, Father Najib's work has been supported by a Benedictine monk from the United States. Father Columba manages an electronic library in which digitized manuscripts are made publicly accessible.
So reading is very important to us. And one of the marvelous things about the monastic life over the centuries is that it has been a place to teach people how to read in periods of time when very few people were literate. So I often tell people that manuscripts are somehow in our DNA, and that it is part of our vocation to do what we can to keep them safe.
The first monk to think like Father Columba was an Italian by the name of Cassiodorus. Anyone in search of his roots has to climb into a boat with archaeologist Chiara Raimondo. When Cassiodorus died in AD 580, the Roman Empire had finally crumbled. He founded a monastery and named it Vivarium, after his famous fish ponds. Cassiodorus was the first abbot to allow monks to read, write and copy books. He established his monastery on his family's estate in Squillace. Squillace, Cassiodorus wrote, hangs over the valley like a vine heavy with ripe grapes. Thanks to his thorough classical education, horticulture and water management flourished. The monastery might well have had glass windows, underfloor heating and bars with hot water, or the result of practical knowledge which Cassiodorus never imagined could ever be lost.
Most late Roman villas were destroyed even before the Vandals invaded. This region was then gradually abandoned during the Greco-Gothic Wars. As a result, knowledge of fish farming was also lost.
Even today, we can still see how the monks extended the bays into the cliff in order to keep the fish so naturally that, as Cassiodorus wrote, they never even felt they were in captivity. Cloths separated the small bays from the sea so that fresh water could constantly flow in and out. The Romans had developed the sophisticated breeding technique of gourmets.
We know from his writings that he bred moray eels and perch, and we know from other sources what the Roman aristocracy fed their fish: dried fruit, figs, and live shrimps. Quality food, in other words, which clearly gave the fish meat an exceptional flavour and an exceptional aroma.
Cassiodorus wrote a textbook that was valid for centuries. In it, he recommended that monks should also read and copy works by pagan authors, because reading, he stressed, is the mother of all knowledge. But he had to be careful. By now, Christianity was gathering force. It had become the state religion, and the works of pagan authors were burnt. After all, why did people need knowledge when they were supposed to believe?
In the 5th century, things truly fall apart or begin seriously to fall apart in the Roman world. The scriptoria, places where people copied manuscripts, are shut down. No one wants to buy new manuscripts. No one has time to read. The schools break down. The market for books breaks down. Libraries are padlocked and shut.
Best-selling author Stephen Greenblatt is fascinated by the fact that even in the chaos of total decline, there were still people who kept a cool head.
So there would be two impulses, let's say, but even to say two is to simplify. One is knock it down. This is tainted goods, poisoned bread. We need to destroy it. But alternatively, no, this is precious. This is something we can use. This is a gift that we can turn to our worship.
Within sight of Cassiodorus's fish ponds, a small church has been excavated. Possibly the monastery church of Vivarium. The cloverleaf apse dates back to even older sources.
The small trefoil apse is probably older than the church itself. It is likely that it was a nymphaeum, the water sanctuary of a Roman settlement, which was part of Cassiodorus's villa. Later, as often happened in antiquity, it was put to other uses, because water was an extremely important element, especially for Christian baptisms.
Cassiodorus lived in two cultures, the classical culture he'd been born into and the Christian one in which he died. It is here that he first saw the light of day, in Scolatium, an ancient town which had a forum, a theatre and a circus. But his birthplace was abandoned even in his lifetime. Artistic sculptures were thrown into the fountains, including the image of a man whom the sculptors of antiquity portrayed so naturally that even the semi-paralysis of his face is recognizable. The ancient town of Scolatium was abandoned and rebuilt on the hills as Squillace. Vivarium Monastery did not last long either. The fate of Cassiodorus's famous library is unknown.
We know for certain that after Cassiodorus's death, both the Vivarium Monastery in Santa Maria de Veteri Squillace and also Squillace Castle were destroyed, probably by the Lombards.
The monastery was destroyed, its manuscripts burnt and its knowledge lost. And yet for centuries Cassiodorus has inspired those hungry for knowledge, right through to the present.
We built a first gallery on the web for digital photographs of manuscripts, and we needed a name for it. And I had been doing a lot of reading about Cassiodorus for my research and found him very interesting. And he was a collector of manuscripts from both the Latin and the Greek worlds. And we were working both in Europe and in Eastern Christian countries. So we took the name Vivarium for that gallery.
400 kilometers north of Schillace lies the Bay of Naples with mighty Mount Vesuvius. Following the volcanic eruption in AD 79, a pyroclastic storm swept over Herculaneum, claiming thousands of lives. Traces of that dramatic event can be seen in the National Library of Naples, the only library of antiquity to have survived through to the present day. Unfortunately, apart from a few fragments, these traces of the past cannot be read.
We suspect that the manuscripts belonged to Philodemus, a philosopher who probably brought them to Herculaneum from Greece. The manuscripts were found in the ruins of a Roman villa, which was owned by the father-in-law of Julius Caesar.
Are we talking perhaps about a lost manuscript penned by Aristotle? Ever since the charred papyri were found in Herculaneum, researchers have been at great pains to make them legible. In the 19th century, a librarian invented a machine designed to carefully open the rolls at a rate of 4 millimeters a week. But it took a scientist from another field, that of optical equipment, to come up with a better idea. Vito Mocella from Naples bombarded the papyrus rolls with X-rays from a particle accelerator to obtain spectacular images from inside them.
We know there are many interesting things, unknown things, and in this papyrus, up to now we work on techniques, not on our idea is not to find something specific.
The murmur that surged through the world's press was that Mocella had managed to decipher individual letters inside the papyrus rolls, but the manuscripts had by no means become legible.
This is the papyrus. You can throw out the volumetric part and finally work on the slice and try to follow the surface.
Vito Mocella has tried to isolate individual letters on the layers of papyrus more clearly in order to obtain further sequences of letters. But all this has produced is a sad, charred copy of ancient books. Hundreds of thousands of books were in circulation in classical times, and this is all that remains of them. Sarajevo lost its books not as a result of a natural disaster, but through a horrific war. In August 1992, the Bosnian Serb army shelled the National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina and set fire to it. The Serbs not only had their sights set on the city's inhabitants, they also deliberately wanted to obliterate Sarajevo's memory. Artists can do little against bullets. Yet in the middle of the war, world-famous singers, conductors and musicians came to Sarajevo and performed Mozart's Requiem in the ruins of the National Library. Zubin Mehta conducted while outside people had to run for their lives to avoid sniper fire. The National Library was completely gutted. The Oriental Institute was also shelled, resulting in the destruction of medieval manuscripts of inestimable value. This loss was deeply felt by the librarian of the last remaining library in Sarajevo.
We knew what had happened to the National Library and the Oriental Institute. Our library could not be left in one place for too long. During the war, we moved it 8 times from place to place.
The Gazi Huzrev Beg Library has its origins in the Madrasa, a religious school in the middle of Sarajevo's old town. After the war in Bosnia, the library was rebuilt in wood and marble. The library is famous for its 20,000 or so priceless medieval manuscripts. In 1992, these manuscripts lay on the far side of the river, in the Gazi Huzrev Mosque, right on the demarcation line.
Crossing this bridge was really dangerous, because towering up at the back is the mountain where Serb snipers were in position. They would pick anyone off. But when there was a lull in the shooting and things were quiet, we'd rush over the bridge as fast as we could. We never all ran together though, always one at a time. And that is how we managed to get all the manuscripts to the other side of the river.
Today, the route they took is a peaceful tourist trip. Mustafa Yahic packed the manuscripts in banana boxes. Since Sarajevo was totally cut off, finding food was a major problem, so the sight of banana boxes attracted many a hungry stare.
The war had been going on for quite some time and food was running short. It was also getting harder to find people willing to help us carry the manuscripts, which were packed in banana boxes. Sometimes young people would come up to us and say, "You've got so many bananas and we haven't got any bread." Then they'd try to grab the boxes. But when they saw that the boxes only contained books, they gave them back to us.
The war in Bosnia also posed a threat to this little book, the Sarajevo Haggadah, written by Jews, stolen by Christians and saved by Muslims. Like its original owners, the book is a nomad. Created in Barcelona in 1350, the Sarajevo Haggadah describes the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. When the Catholic kings expelled the Jews from Spain, the book found its way to Venice. The church there took a hard line towards those of different faiths, and the Venetian censor, Vistorini, took a very close look at the book to see whether the Haggadah contained anything at variance with Catholic doctrine. During the war, Andrea Dautovic stuck it out in the National Museum and risked her life for Bosnia's cultural heritage. She held firm, like Vistorini, the Venetian censor, who perhaps deliberately overlooked a few things.
That was the period when the church was very strict about the content of the books, so almost every book had to be inspected and decided should it be left alive or burnt at stakes.
The book got past the censor, even though it contained images which at the time contradicted Catholic doctrine. The Haggadah showed, for instance, that the earth is a sphere and not flat.
So it is very interesting how the book survived censorship, Catholic censorship, with such images in it. So some of authorities think that maybe the censor was converted Jew.
Revisto da me, revised by me, Vistorini wrote. At some time or other the book ended up in Sarajevo, where in 1895 a certain Joseph Cohn sold it to the National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Cohns went to Sarajevo perhaps because for centuries Jews, Muslims and Christians there had been able to live side by side in peace. Despite religious, linguistic and cultural differences, the people of Sarajevo shared a history. Until 1992, when the Bosnian War destroyed their common ground. But the book hunter community is international and knows no religion. The National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina has guarded the Haggadah for over 120 years. In 1992, no one here was prepared for a war. Nevertheless, a slender Muslim scholar set out to save the Jewish book.
There were no civilians left in the city, only combatants. There was shooting everywhere, and there was bombing. When I arrived at the museum, all the staff had gone. Only the porter and his family were left. We went in to look for the Haggadah. Now, just imagine the size of the 4 huge museum buildings, and only 2 people ever knew where the Haggadah was kept, the curator and his secretary. But they had already fled and couldn't be reached. Searching for the Haggadah was like looking for a needle in a haystack.
The professors searched for the book with a handful of Bosnian soldiers. In the end, they found the Haggadah in the boiler room.
When I finally held the Haggadah in my hands, I opened it and smelt it. The smell of ancient leather told me that I really was holding the original. I turned to the soldiers and said, "Lads, this is it." Imagine how overjoyed we were. We had at last found the book we had risked our lives for that day.
Risking your life for a heap of old paper is a concept not unfamiliar to the people of Iraq either. On August the 6th, 2014, the inhabitants of Karakos in northern Iraq had to leave their homes in a hurry. They included many Christians and Father Najib. Islamic State had attacked the town.
We continued to digitize manuscripts right up until that final evening. Then came the drama of the night of August the 6th. We left along with tens of thousands of other cars. The road was completely jammed, and then we heard that the Kurdish checkpoint had been closed.
Kurdish Peshmerga had protected Karakos right up to August the 6th, but then had suddenly withdrawn, with awful consequences for the inhabitants, for Father Najib, and for his ancient books.
We didn't know where to go, so we got out of our cars. A little girl came up to me and said, "Father, Father, look over there to the right." It was early dawn, and the sun was just rising. And then I saw hundreds of black and white flags, the flags of Islamic State. The men were in their vehicles and ready to attack. "It's over," I said. "We're going to die together." But suddenly we heard that the frontier was open. We were allowed to walk through the checkpoint. We just took the bare essentials with us, whatever we could carry. Fortunately, I had youngsters with me. Whenever I saw any of them with empty hands, I asked them to take a book with them. One girl, about 10 years old, carried 4 or 5 books. Manuscripts dating back to the 13th or 14th century. She carried them through to the other side of the border, and in doing so, rescued her heritage.
Totally exhausted and traumatized, the people from Karakos were stranded in Erbil, the big Kurdish town in northern Iraq. All the refugees had was what they carried in a few plastic bags. It is almost a miracle that Father Najib was able to save his precious manuscripts. Fortunately, he only had a few with him. He had taken most of the books to Erbil just a few days before their headlong flight from Karakos. A premonition, he reckons. Father Najib's library receives a constant stream of newcomers. This book was brought to him from Baghdad. 20 years ago, monks in a monastery walled it up to prevent it from being seized by Saddam Hussein's cultural authority. Unfortunately, it was then forgotten about and was only recently rediscovered. For centuries, people read the book by candlelight, as evidenced by the spots of wax.
The manuscripts are cleaned and prepared before being digitized with a truly professional technique and professional equipment. So this room is extremely important for storing all these extremely old manuscripts and documenting them with a camera. I'm now going to show you an incredibly important treasure. This little room is where we store the oldest documents.
Books written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, which Christians in Iraq still cultivate even today. Written in the 17th century, this book shows Jesus entering Jerusalem. Another work preserves musical traditions.
Hosanna, 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 libni Daud, Hosanna, Rabbi Jenud.
The author wrote in Arabic and also in French and phonetically. This is currently the oldest handwritten manuscript we have. We have never had anything like it before.
When they went to Iraq in the 17th century, the Dominicans from Italy took their library with them. Sometimes the old binding is found to contain papers that are even older. Here, a Hebrew manuscript was used to strengthen the book cover.
Look at this, for example. The binding is open. Can you see that? The binding was already damaged, and by chance, when I opened it up a bit, I found something remarkable. I discovered a small piece of paper, a very old scrap of parchment. As I cleaned it up somewhat, more and more of a text in Latin came to light.
The text is a lot older than the book Father Najib found it in. Dating back to the 9th century, it tells the story of Moses and was perhaps written in a German monastery. A long journey for a little piece of paper.
You can see the difference between the front and the reverse side of this parchment. This side is where the flesh of the animal once was. The other side used to be covered with the creature's hair. So you could say that this animal has stayed alive ever since the 9th century, and is no doubt happy to bear this text. So we say a big thank you to a creature which left us its skin for us to write our history on.
So in Iraq, as in every place we work, it's a matter of finding somebody who can be a kind of bridge for us. And so sometimes I say our job is to find heroes or people who have contacts, connections, and relationships, and that allows the access. So instead of my going to a monastery or a bishop, as an American, although as a Benedictine, it's a little different, but still I'm an American, and saying, show me your manuscripts and allow me to photograph them, we work through local partners. So in Iraq, it's Father Najib, and other countries, there are similar people who play that role. With the upgrade, sitting in the front row.
Father Columba travels internationally in search of ancient manuscripts, hoping to find them before they are destroyed in the crisis regions of our planet. In Lebanon, a civil war raged for many years. When it ended, the Lebanese Hezbollah became embroiled in a conflict with neighboring Israel. Since 2006, a fragile peace has existed and the country is slowly returning to normality. Father Columba's electronic library has already photographed over 135,000 manuscripts, 45 million pages of paper, secured one by one, and it all began in Austria.
The mission from the beginning was to find manuscripts that were under some kind of threat or thought to be in danger. So in 1965, it was Europe, the Cold War, in Austria. We were afraid there would be a nuclear war. And Austria was unique in Europe because the monasteries kept their manuscripts, whereas elsewhere they were taken into national libraries. So we began to work with the Austrian Benedictine monasteries, and it spread from there.
In northern Iraq, Father Columba has come to visit one of the country's oldest monasteries, Balamand Monastery. Founded in 1157 during the days of the Crusaders, it was originally a Cistercian monastery. Today, Greek Orthodox monks live here. They collected ancient manuscripts and established an important library. In the finest monastic tradition, the monks also copied manuscripts from other monasteries. It takes a lot of tact to convince the patriarchs of the church to have their old manuscripts digitized. Here, the book hunter is actually more of a book diplomat.
There is hunting to find the place, and then the diplomacy begins. So it is a combination of research and pursuit, and sometimes one has to keep coming back again and again. So there's the hunting part, always looking, trying to find. But then when we find the place, instead of killing it like a hunter, instead we begin the conversation and build the relationship. So diplomacy is a key part of it.
With the help of Father Columba's American benefactors, ancient manuscripts have been restored and digitized here for quite some time. The monastery suffered a number of losses during the Civil War, so the monks immediately understood the importance of digitization. Unfortunately, though, the book copies were secured on DVDs. After only 10 years, they had already had it, a ridiculously low durability compared with parchment made from donkey skin. This time, Father Columba wants to discuss with Johannes X, the Patriarch of Antioch, how the digitized books can always be kept at the latest technical level.
Thank you. It has been many,
Unless something is done, the next loss will soon happen. The struggle to save old books is never-ending. Father Columba's mission is financed from donations. The electronic library is accessible to everyone via the internet. The ancient books remain where they are. But even so, tradition-conscious church fathers are often skeptical about subjecting their manuscripts to this process. Venice. In the 15th century, the city was at the center of the Renaissance. Here, with great enthusiasm, the Middle Ages were left behind, and antiquity, with its philosophy, its knowledge and its culture, was rediscovered. The Renaissance received decisive impetus from book hunters. Their impassioned search for classical manuscripts took humanists to the most remote monastic libraries in Europe. One of the most important book hunters was a Greek cardinal, Basilius Vivarium. His books form the basis of one of the most beautiful libraries in the world. The Marciana, located on the lagoon south of St. Mark's Square, in the heart of Venice. It is to Cardinal Vivarium that we owe several of the oldest copies of works by Plato. In the Middle Ages, only incomplete Latin translations were known. In the medieval structure of faith, being able to read the philosopher's writing in the original Greek impacted like an explosive charge of modern thinking.
The importance of these manuscripts lies in the propagation of Plato's ideas, which began in the West in the late 15th century. With the emergence of his works in the original Greek, his ideas were transported from the East to the West.
In Italy in 1453, Cardinal Bessarion learnt that his home city of Constantinople had been captured and plundered by the Turks. The literary heritage of antiquity had been preserved longer in the East than the West, but now Constantinople's libraries were in flames. There was only one thing Cardinal Bessarion could do. Through merchants, he purchased as many manuscripts as he could afford. After his death in 1472, in keeping with his wishes, the cardinal's manuscripts were donated to the city of Venice. This enabled the first ever public library to be established. But it was not until around 100 years later that Venice recognized the value of the collection and built this splendid hall for the books of Basilos Bessarion. Up until then, they had lain unnoticed in some dark corner. By the time the library was opened, many of the manuscripts had already disappeared. The cardinal had lived in Grotta Ferrata near Rome. In his honor, even today, the town still calls itself the City of Books. The monastery of Santa Maria di Grottaferrata is said to have been built on the remains of a summer villa reputedly owned at one time by the Roman philosopher Cicero. A monastery constructed on classical, philosophical ground, the perfect environment for a book hunter like Bessarion. Cardinal Bessarion was the abbot at this monastery, a Greek enclave in a Roman Catholic world. The monastery is famous for its restoration workshop, in which time seems to have stood still. Centuries-old books are restored and rebound with techniques that are every bit as old. It can be assumed that manuscripts made from hide will endure for around 400 years, even longer if the climate is particularly dry. Paper doesn't survive quite that long. If a book is not copied or restored within this time frame, there is a risk of it decaying. So preserving books has always been a race against time. The enemies of ancient books are numerous and varied. A whole army of tiny creatures abounds in old folios. The bookworm is not alone.
There's another form of degradation where paper is concerned. Destruction by microbacteria through fungal infection. There are many different types of fungus that can cause paper to decay.
In Grotta Ferrata, too, the monks diligently copied manuscripts. But this was a most unpopular activity. Writing is so irksome. You do it with just 3 fingers, but your whole body aches. Just like a sailor yearns to reach his home port, as a scribe, you long for the last line. The scribes recycled ancient parchment. The old script was scratched off, and the new text written in its place. But copying the works of pagan authors was still precarious.
A medieval guide to gesture language to use for lots of different, of course, in silent monasteries you had to make gestures for lots of different things. And one of the things was a set of gestures for the kind of book that you would read, a Christian book. Or I think the ordinary pagan book that was not particularly problematical was, I think you just scratched behind your ear as if you had a louse there. But if it was a text regarded as particularly problematical or dangerous, then you made kind of gagging gesture.
Chance, preference, ignorance. Which book was copied and which wasn't depended on many factors. Often the fate of a book hung by a thread. Some manuscripts survived solely as a single copy, and in many cases it was the humanists who rescued it. Cardinal Vivarium was laid to rest in the Santi Apostoli Church in Rome. But in the 18th century, his crypt was built over with pompous marble and sank into oblivion. It was only rediscovered a few years ago, along with a Roman sarcophagus and Renaissance frescoes. Thanks to Cardinal Vivarium's tireless efforts, many books have been preserved. But even in his day, many more had already vanished, a painful loss even today.
We know that Oedipus, Sophocles' Oedipus, won second prize in the Festival of Dionysus that year. Wouldn't you like to see the play that won first prize? That actually was judged better than Oedipus? Is gone. We don't have it. So I think that'll be my vote for today at least.
But referring to Germania by Tacitus, one historian claimed that it would have been better if some works had vanished. Yet Germania is one of the few sources of information on the early period in Northern Europe. Without Tacitus's work, we would be left in the dark. Today, the Roman historian's work is kept in the National Library in Rome. By the time humanists found Germania in the Renaissance period, there was only one copy still in existence. Later, the Nazis were desperate to get hold of it. They used Tacitus to justify their Teutonic cult. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazi police force, sent an SS unit to the home of the manuscript's owner with instructions to steal the Germania. But Tacitus's work remained undetected in a laundry basket. After the war, the owner took the manuscript to a bank in Florence and put it in a safe deposit box, one day before the city was severely flooded. The Germania floated in a mixture of excrement and petrol. It took 10 years to restore the manuscript at the workshop in Grottoferrata. The book hunters of the Renaissance had begun to copy and disseminate the precious manuscript. If a manuscript reached the days of the first printing presses, it could be expected to survive. The National Socialists also wanted to get their hands on the Haggadah in Sarajevo. During the Second World War, a German officer demanded that the Jewish book be handed over to him. But the Muslim curator smuggled it out of the museum. So Enver Imamovich was already the second Muslim scholar to rescue the Haggadah.
Imagine you're a doctor. You're driving somewhere and you see a road accident. Even if it's not your patient who is involved, you are still going to stop and help. I'm an expert on books, and it makes no difference to me whether a work is Catholic, Orthodox, Islamic, or whatever. It really does not matter at all. I only see the cultural and historic value of a book. I do not regard it as representing a certain religion or a nation.
After the odyssey they experienced in the Bosnian War, the 20,000 manuscripts in the Gazi Huzref Beg Mosque are now secure in air-conditioned storage. Mustafa Yahic, too, not only saved Islamic manuscripts. The cultural heritage of Sarajevo's Muslims is diverse and has nothing to do with the ignorance of radical Islamists. The particularly precious works, Persian poetry and medieval books on astronomy written by Islamic scholars, are kept in a safe.
Bosnians wrote works in Arabic, Turkish, Persian and Bosnian, and these works are part of the cultural heritage of Bosnia and Herzegovina. To a certain extent, they help people to understand the multicultural aspect and the Islamic dimension of the cultural legacy of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
The story of the gutted National Library in Sarajevo only seems to have had a happy ending. The library was rebuilt with funds from the European Union. A commemorative plaque calls to mind the 2 million books that were reduced to ashes here. But because the ethnic groups, the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Serbs and Croats, cannot agree on who should finance the library, there is not a single book in it, even today. Personally, Father Columba still places his faith in the good old notebook. He has come to the Maronite University in Beirut to visit one of the most modern restoration workshops in the Middle East. Several groups of visitors a day disturb the meditative calm of the restorers, who stick together tiny pieces of paper with the patience of a saint. State-of-the-art technology creates digital reproductions at a rate of knots. Today, manuscripts from all over this unstable region are digitized at the Maronite University.
In Lebanon during the Civil War, there were manuscripts which were disappeared or in some cases stolen. There are very few examples that I'm aware of actual destruction by fire or explosion or whatever. In most cases, it was a matter of things being dislocated, and the risk then was somebody might steal a valuable manuscript. So we know of manuscripts that were held for ransom, and some of which have never come back yet, and others which were very famous, beautiful, illuminated manuscripts which simply disappeared.
Father Columba's next appointment is with the Patriarch of the Armenian Church in Beirut. Gregoire Bedros XX has received the American monk for a chat in French. Because of the complex structure of the Eastern Church, it is of vital importance for many of its leaders to support the manuscript rescue campaign. But where the amiable Gregoire Bedros XX is concerned, that is not a problem. You are welcome at any time, the Armenian Patriarch tells Father Columba, anytime you are passing through. So the monk from the United States has achieved a minor diplomatic success. In times of great suffering, refugees probably couldn't care less about the fate of old books. Father Najib, however, is supported by a community which might have lost relatives and friends, their homeland and their property, but are still not prepared to give up their history as well.
Every time I take a book in my hands, I feel a very strong bond with it. What is in the book? Who created it? Who wrote the message that has been handed down from the Middle Ages? How was this legacy comprehended in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries? It is our responsibility to preserve this legacy for future generations.
Book hunters have retained a feeling for the fact that a civilization can disappear.
I'm a Benedictine. We have long memories. We remember the Vikings. We remember other challenges. Could there be a catastrophic break in the continuity of Western civilization? I think there certainly could be. If there were, for example, a major technological catastrophe, the ultimate hack of the internet. So this is why we have to be attentive to protecting cultural heritage while we can, and why we have to make sure that we have several copies in different locations, so that in the case of a problem one place, there would be a copy somewhere else.